In the early 1980s, 20-year-old Sandra Smith, her husband Philip Smith, and their 2 children were living with Sandra's parents in Mitchell's Plain, Cape Town, South Africa. Everyone who knew her described her as a loving mother and a kind-hearted woman. However, Sandra and Philip's marriage wasn't doing too well. This was particularly because Philip worked as a fisherman and he would spend long periods at sea, sending money back home to Sandra and the children. It was alleged that Sandra might have been bored and frustrated with her life. She was living with her parents and raising 2 young children. She craved some adventure in her life. In 1983, she made the decision to send a letter to Yassiem Harris, a local criminal and member of the Hard Livings gang. Little did she know that this decision would drastically alter the course of her life. Hi, my name is Faith Njoroge. Welcome to True Crime Tuesday, a series where I talk about true crime cases in Africa. I upload new videos every other Tuesday, and if you like true crime like me, please subscribe to my channel and turn on the notifications. If you'd like to find out more about this case, I put links on all of my sources in the description box below. Yassiem Harris had a bad reputation. He had been involved in crime since the age of 13 and was known to take drugs such as mandrax, a sedative hypnotic drug that is similar in effect to barbiturates. When he was 15, he dropped out of school in order to get a job to supplement his family's income. His first job was working alongside his father as a car sound specialist in Claremont, Cape Town. This job was short-lived as he stole 10,000 rand in cash and 26,000 rand in checks from his employer. Since he was a juvenile, he was sentenced to corporal punishment and received 6 strokes of the cane. Later, his father claimed that the beating made no impression on him. He drifted from job to job and eventually became a member of a gang known as the Hard Livings Gang. After some time, he was arrested for the second time for breaking into a school. He got sentenced to corporal punishment, receiving an additional 6 strokes of the cane. Again, the punishment did not make any impression on him. Shortly after his 17th birthday in October 1983, Yassiem was surprised to receive money and a letter from Sandra Smith asking him to meet her at the park. He agreed to meet her. At the subsequent meeting, she told him how much she admired him. Yassiem later stated that Sandra asked if he wanted to sleep over because her husband had left with the ship. They spent the night together and started having an affair. Yassiem would sneak into Sandra's room in her parents' house through the window and spend every night with her. Yassiem was jobless and Sandra would give him some of the money that her husband would send to her. Unsurprisingly, he soon gave up any pretense of looking for a job. After they had been seeing each other for about 6 months, their relationship faced its first crisis when Philip, Sandra's husband, returned from sea and learned of his wife's affair from some neighbors. He responded by getting help from 3 of his friends and proceeded to beat up Yassiem. He thought the beating would scare Yassiem and keep him away from his wife. However, unbeknownst to him, his actions did not stop the couple. They simply waited for Philip to go back to work at sea and resumed their affair. In fact, the affair between Yassiem and Sandra continued for over 2.5 years. When Sandra's husband was home, they would stop seeing each other and then resume the relationship when he left for work again. In fact, during these times, Sandra and Yassiem would live like husband and wife. His relationship with Sandra did not prevent Yassiem from pursuing other women. During the periods where Sandra's husband was home, Yassiem would loiter outside local high schools in the mornings, chatting up schoolgirls and making plans to meet them in the afternoons. It was during one of these escapades that he met a beautiful young student called Jermaine Abrahams. He struck up a conversation with her and followed her home. In 1985, Sandra became pregnant for a third time. However, she wasn't sure if the child was her husband's child or Yassiem's child. Nevertheless, she told her husband that the child was his. In March of 1986, a terrible storm forced the fishing boats to anchor at Table Bay. Philip decided to surprise Sandra, so he hopped on the first train home. Unfortunately, Philip was the one to get the surprise of a lifetime, as he found his wife in bed with Yassiem. Yassiem fled the scene through the window to avoid getting beat up again by Philip. Sandra also decided to run away, and she followed Yassiem, abandoning her children in the process. Heartbroken, Philip moved the children to his parents' care. He left a note for Sandra informing her that their marriage was over, and so was the free supply of money he had been providing. For a time after the breakup of her marriage, Sandra stayed with friends in Grassy Park. Then, with Yassiem's help, she found lodgings in Mitchell's Plain. But within a few months, all her money was spent and things were becoming desperate. She decided to move in with Yassiem in his rented apartment and started becoming involved in his criminal activities. To make ends meet, they started renting video recorders from shops and illegally selling them, but this did not make them any real money. Yassiem, who was unemployed, was still spending his time hanging outside high schools, chatting up schoolgirls. At this point, he had befriended 16-year-old Jermaine Abrahams. He soon found out where she lived, and from conversations with her, he concluded that her family was wealthy. Sandra and Yassiem soon hatched up a plan to break into the Abrahams family home and steal her mother's jewelry and anything else of value. Yassiem and Sandra started planning the robbery. Yassiem suggested this particular house because he claimed to have broken into the place a year earlier and stolen a large amount of money. He saw no reason why they shouldn't find valuable property yet again. In addition, he knew that Mr. and Mrs. Abrahams usually left for work before 7 a.m. and that their daughter, Jermaine, left for school at about 7:40 a.m. On the 1st of September 1986, Yassiem and Sandra arrived at the Abrahams family home at about 7:30 a.m. Yassiem knocked on the door and Jermaine answered. He asked if she could let him into the house to use the telephone. They got into the house and tied her up. Their plan was interrupted when someone started knocking on the door. Jermaine started screaming for help. In an attempt to keep her quiet, Yassiem tried to strangle her with a dishcloth. He then fetched a knife from the kitchen and repeatedly stabbed Jermaine. Amazingly, she didn't die from her injuries. She managed to get up and stagger a few paces before collapsing. At this point, Jermaine had been stabbed 25 times. Yassiem then carried Jermaine to her parents' bedroom and made her show him where the valuable jewelry was kept. He wrapped her up in a sheet and then cut her throat, leaving her to bleed to death. He and Sandra ransacked the house, collected what they wanted, and fled. Two weeks after the murder, Sandra was questioned by the police regarding the video renting scam that she and Yassiem had earlier been involved in. During the interrogation, she surprised the interviewing officer by confessing to the murder of Jermaine Abrahams. She wept under cross-examination and stated that she was not able to live with the guilt of the murder. On the 15th of September, Sandra Smith was charged with the murder of Jermaine Abrahams and robbery with aggravated circumstances. 5 days later, Yassiem Harris was arrested and charged with the same. At this point, Sandra and Yassiem admitted to being at the scene of the crime, but gave police conflicting statements on the version of events that happened during the murder, with each one blaming the other. Sandra and Yassiem appeared at a preliminary hearing at the Mitchell's Plain Magistrates Court on the 23rd of September. They pleaded guilty to murder, alternatively to culpable homicide, and to stealing 2,000 rand worth of jewelry. According to Sandra's version of events, Yassiem knocked on the Abrahams family door, and when Jermaine answered, he asked if he could make a telephone call. According to Sandra, Yassiem did not introduce her to Jermaine, and Jermaine asked him to go to her bedroom where she could speak to him. At first, Sandra sat in the front room, then she became impatient. Sandra said, quote, "I heard voices. I went to her bedroom because I wanted to see what was going on." She said that she overheard Yassiem telling Jermaine, quote, "Sandra and I are going to tie you up and steal things from the house. Don't tell your parents it was us." Yassiem then locked the front door and put the key in his pocket. They then tied Jermaine up, and while she was on the bedroom floor, lying on her stomach, someone knocked at the front door. She tried to scream for help and struggled to get free, but Yassiem clamped his hand over her mouth while Sandra held her legs. When the knocking stopped, Yassiem and Sandra put a dishcloth around Jermaine's throat to throttle her so that she would become faint. Sandra said, quote, "I didn't want to pull tight on my side." According to Sandra, Yassiem then went into the kitchen and returned wearing orange kitchen gloves and carrying a knife. He then started to stab Jermaine repeatedly. According to Sandra, after the attack, Jermaine managed to get free and get to her feet. She took a few steps and fell over. She got up, staggered into the passage, and collapsed once more. Yassiem then carried Jermaine into her parents' bedroom. Jermaine had told them that her mother's jewelry was under the wardrobe. Sandra stated that she went to retrieve the jewelry while Yassiem stood over Jermaine. Sandra told the court, quote, "Jermaine kept pleading with us to let her live, saying that she didn't want to die. After she showed us where the jewelry was, she was getting weak. We put her on the bed. She became cold and asked for water. We did not give her any. She began to bleed more. Then Yassiem closed his eyes and slit her throat." She added that Yassiem killed the schoolgirl so that she would not identify them, but afterwards he started to feel sorry for her. Sandra claimed that she would hear Jermaine begging Yassiem to spare her life. After Sandra had found the valuables, she handed them to Yassiem and then began a systematic search of the cupboards. She saw that the sheet had been pulled over Jermaine's head, and it was then that she realized that Yassiem had murdered Jermaine. After Jermaine was dead, they collected the items they wanted to steal, and with Yassiem wearing a pair of tracksuit pants to cover the blood on his trousers, they made their escape. Sandra said that she did not want Jermaine to die, but Yassiem was afraid that she would be able to identify them if she was left alive. According to Yassiem's version of events, Sandra was the one that had asked him to stab Jermaine after becoming frustrated and enraged when Jermaine refused to talk. Yassiem told the court, quote, "I began throttling her with a dishcloth, but she still refused to talk. She wriggled for a few seconds, made some gurgling sounds, and then lay still. When she regained consciousness, she was crying, but still refused to talk. I went on my knees and told her that she mustn't worry, but Sandra became angry." He claimed the knife was lying on the dressing table, and Sandra picked it up and instructed him to stab her to death. Yassiem said, quote, "I just grabbed the knife out of her hand and started stabbing Jermaine continuously. She was lying on the floor on her stomach, and as I was stabbing her, she turned onto her back, but I still went on stabbing." He also claimed that Sandra had been watching and smiling as he stabbed her. He carried her to her parents' room, then Jermaine told them where the valuables were. Yassiem said that Jermaine pleaded with him, telling him that she did not want to die. He said, quote, "I realized that she would not die from the stab wounds, so I closed my eyes and slit her throat." During the trial, intimate love letters, which the duo had written to each other discussing their sex life, were read out in court. In the letters, Sandra professes her love for Yassiem and the satisfaction that he gave her. Some noticed that this seemed to embarrass Sandra more than the accusation of murder that she was facing. Having heard all the evidence, Justice Munich gave a full reasoned judgment. During his 2-hour summing up, he described Yassiem as an appalling witness. The judge maintained that Yassiem had wielded the knife throughout and that his parrot-like repetition of "I don't know" when repeatedly asked why he killed the victim was merely a ploy. He said it was clear that it was Yassiem who had stabbed the girl and killed her to prevent her from identifying them. He also rejected Yassiem's defense claim that he had been dominated by Sandra. This had been refuted by the psychiatrist giving evidence for the prosecution. He accepted that Sandra was demanding, but not dominant, and that there was no evidence to indicate that she pressurized Yassiem into committing any crimes that he would not normally commit, nor that she had done anything to prevent the murder. The judge concluded that both Sandra and Yassiem helped each other throughout and were equally responsible for the crime under the doctrine of common purpose. On the 11th of December 1986, they were both formally convicted of the murder of Jermaine Abrahams and with robbery with aggravating circumstances. The two were remanded as they awaited sentencing. 11 days later, on the 22nd of December 1986, Sandra and Yassiem were brought back to the court for sentencing. They each received the mandatory sentence for murder, death by hanging. Additionally, Yassiem was sentenced to 10 years in prison for robbery with aggravated circumstances, while Sandra was sentenced to 7 years for the same. When the death sentence was handed down, Sandra became hysterical and had to be carried from the dock kicking and screaming. Yassiem, on the other hand, was apparently unmoved. They were transferred to the country's only death row at Pretoria Central Prison, a modern facility on the outskirts of the capital, where all South African executions were carried out. Their appeals were turned down. There was also a review of the trial transcripts carried out by the Ministry of Justice to determine whether to recommend that the state president grant clemency, but it failed to find any mitigating circumstances. As clemency was not forthcoming, the execution date was set for the 2nd of June 1989. Although executions in South Africa were held in private, the procedure was described in detail by the then hangman Chris Barnard in an interview before he died. He officiated over 1,500 hangings. On Friday, June 2, 1989, Sandra's executioner handled her according to the execution protocol. At 6:50 a.m., the hangman came to walk her to the gallows. She was wearing a prison overall and slippers. She was to be hanged together with 6 other male prisoners, including Yassiem. Sandra and Yassiem met for the first time in over 2.5 years. They were led the 52 steps to the pre-execution room next to the gallows. Their death warrants were read to them, and they were given the opportunity to say their last words. Their hands were handcuffed behind them and white hoods placed over their heads. They were led forward by warders into the large and brightly lit execution room. Sandra moved forward to the trapdoor to her position next to Yassiem. The executioner pulled the modern-type noose over her head and then covered her face with the front of the hood. The lever was pulled and the prisoners plummeted to their deaths. After they were declared dead, they were lowered onto a stretcher and placed directly into their coffins and taken to a public cemetery for burial. 24-year-old Sandra Smith was the last woman to be executed in South Africa. In November 1990, President F.W. de Klerk ordered a nationwide moratorium ordering a stay on all scheduled executions. Under the democratic dispensation, the death penalty was completely abolished, bringing an end to a system that saw 3,500 people hanged at the Pretoria Central Prison. There were rumors circulating that an investigative officer claimed that Yassiem had told him that Sandra was the one that did the actual killing. She did it because she was jealous of the victim, because she thought Yassiem was attracted to her. Despite this, Yassiem had confessed to the killing because of his love for Sandra. We'll probably never know if this claim was true or not. Thank you so much for watching until the end. Again, what are your thoughts on this case? Do you believe that Sandra was really the mastermind, or were Sandra and Yassiem equally to blame for the crime? So let me know in the comment section below. Please like, share, and subscribe to my channel. Also, you could leave suggestions on which African cases I should talk about next. If you'd like to read more on this case, I put links on all of my sources in the description box below. Feel free to check them out. Again, thank you so much for watching. See you next week. Stay safe.